That is me. So from a standpoint, what we're going to be talking about over the next hour, we'll briefly get to how we got here, and it was just about a year ago in March of last year. We'll go through the issues that we saw, and some were surprising, some were not. And then the meat of the presentation will be within most of those issues, internal controls that I think could help all of us working with those issues that popped up and how they had many of us go into a remote environment, where many of us still are. Getting into what does that mean for the future, and then if there is time at the end, we'll get into some questions. So speaking of questions, let's get rolling with poll question number 1. Let's see how well I listened to how we did do this yesterday. All right. We are up and running with the poll question. Poll question number 1, since March of 2020, things have changed materially for you, maybe a little bit, or have not changed at all? I'll give you a little bit more time to answer those. Give you a few more seconds. Okay. I'm going to close this one out, but the majority was B, changed a little bit. 23 respondents, 15 said changed materially, and we did have one interesting enough that says it's not changed much at all. And I'm sure that most of us on this call would consider those folks to be fortunate. So I'm going to close that one out, and we'll go to the next slide. So let's take a look at last March, when everything hit, and it was just around the middle of March when things got very serious, and actually it skyrocketed really from where things were last February at this time, and then right about in the middle of March, it became serious, and everything started to shut down, not just financial institutions, but certainly, we all had to take the steps that may have been forced by governors, may have been on our own accord or whatever. And it brought up a situation, were we ready or not? And what we certainly saw was that several were ready. There were some that were perhaps not. And again, the discussions, if we remember at this point last year, the seriousness of the pandemic and the potential effects were still pretty much unknown, and there were still conversations, more people get sick from the flu, it's not a big deal. And, within a matter of weeks, it seemingly everybody was shut down in some way, shape, or form. And for our banks and credit unions out there, it started out, lobbies were closed down almost immediately, and then ops soon followed for many of us. And what that did do is it brought up issues. And we're going to, we'll get into the next couple of slides have bulleted out some of the issues that we did see, and then we'll take a deeper dive into these within the next section after this, as it pertains to controls that we may that we have some recommendations, and also some situations that popped up as a result of the corresponding working remotely. So our customers and our members, everything needs to start off with that, because without them, we don't have a business. Then our employees, and we're going to go over several slides coming up with what we saw employees, controls that may be implemented, some situations that did arise that were expected versus unexpected. Information security, obviously paramount with everything that we do. Although many situations and have arisen based on the pandemic, customer and member information security is still as critical as it was, if not even more so, because there could be a chance that controls have weakened. Lending, I think most of us have had a lot of changes in all things lending over the last year. Our branches, how we reacted to within our lobbies, having our depositors have access to the cash. We're going to also get into a couple of areas down the road pertaining to Bank Secrecy Act, AML, that, again, for want of a better word, an unintended consequence with the pandemic and how it affected BSA, AML. Segregation of duties, how we're able to keep those going despite changes that we've had with the folks who are working remotely. The need to go through within policies and procedures of how what may need to be updated. Employee signatures, that is a very common part of our everyday world, and how making sure that those are still in place for items that need to be approved. Disaster recovery and continuity plans, obviously control that would need to be in place, and taking a look at the pandemic sections that are hopefully part of it. What it's done to office space. There's a couple of slides that I'll be enhancing with an article that was in the Albany Times-Union just on Sunday, 2 days ago. One of them is dealing with changes in office space needs. So with that, let's take a look at how we've addressed working remotely. And we'll start this off with another question. Danielle, I'm having problems getting that second poll question up there. All right, folks, I do apologize. We're going to have to hold off on this second polling question. And Danielle, it's not giving me the option of opening the poll. Try it one more time. All right, we'll have to come back to that one. I do apologize for that. So let's take a look at internal controls in a remote environment. And we'll start off again with our customers and our members, because everything revolves around them, and we don't have the decent controls in place for that. Nothing else really matters. So from a standpoint, for those of you old enough to remember, within the Y2K environment, all right, it looks like we've got the poll question up there. And poll question number 2 is, as a result of the pandemic, what percentage of your employees work remotely during the past year? Was it 67 to 100%, 34 to 66%, 1 to 33%, or none? And I'm not sure you folks are able to see that, so I'm going to just keep rolling. So at any rate, during the Y2K period in 1999, there was a big concern as to how we'd be able to that everything was computer-wise was going to just fall to ground, and we weren't going to be able to reach our customers and our members. They weren't going to have access to cash, and there was all kinds of uncertainty. As somebody who was working during that period, I can tell you that midnight came and went, and nothing really happened except we were all forced to work at midnight, and nothing happened. That's not the case here. There are some similar concerns, and the notifications to our customers and members continues to be critical. And one area thing that can be, you want to make sure that you're continuing to do well as situations have changed with what's open versus what's not open, is to have those notifications out there in a timely manner and have them accurate. I can tell you that my financial institution, there's often I go on their website 3-4 times a day, and there's often situations where they're saying they're putting something up there that is outdated. And so you want to make sure that whatever the situation is, branches now open, branches now closed, what's lobbies open, that all of that information is out there. The last thing, especially this time of year, it's been a tough winter. You don't want someone going out there and not to a branch and finding out that it's closed. Access to cash. Again, that was a big issue within Y2K, and there were ATMs around at the time. We did not have the ITMs at the time, and the ITMs tend to hold more cash. We want to make sure that you never want to have a situation, obviously, where your customers and members don't have access to the cash. So going through and making sure that the cash is out there for them, especially if lobbies are closed and or if the depositor does not want to come into the lobby because of fear of health issues. You see the fourth bullet on their health and safety. There's several slides coming up talking about written policies and procedures, and it's likely that as a result of life in the pandemic world, that access, you may have to bump up some of the cash limits that you have in your machines, or maybe even bumping up what's allowed to come out of either the ATM or the ITM, and you want to just make sure that with all of this, and again, we'll get into some more specifics, policies, procedures, you're keeping track of changes, and what you have in writing is actually what's in place as things change, sometimes almost daily. And I've got a slide there for uncertainty as well. As much as we are all uncertain as to how things are going to change, our customers and our members are as well. And, reassuring them, having them always take a look, feeling that their financial institution is dealing with this as best they can, and that everything is going to be as much as possible the same for them as it comes to accessing their cash and being able to enter their financial institution. That is certainly critical. Employees are critical as well, and if we don't have if our employees are not good, we're not good either. And one of the items, and one of the, again, perhaps not surprisingly, unintended consequence of everything that's changed in the pandemic world is employee morale. And I'm going to read this article I had just talked about, and a poll conducted by the Martech Group found that 84% of employees say that working from home is harming their mental health and increasing stress. Employees between 35 and 45 working in management roles have been the most poorly impacted by working remotely, while younger female employees working entry level were likely to be more thriving. So we want to keep our employees happy, as always, with making sure that productivity is still in place. So I think it all has to start there, as our employees have worked from home and continue to do so. By the way, that's the result of the second poll, most of you answered that 67 to 100% of employees had worked from home. Process changes. I mentioned that a moment ago, and I'm going to mention that more coming up. Obviously, standard operating procedure has changed and will likely change for the foreseeable future, if not on an ongoing basis. And we need to have the health and safety of our employees always first and foremost. We have dozens and dozens of financial institutions for whom we do work, and I can tell you that the protocols put in place throughout the Northeast did vary from place to place. Some had very strict protocols. I had one client where I let him borrow my pen, and they had said, no, I'm not going to touch that. You touch that. Whereas we had other places where, frankly, the masks were not all over the place, and so it pretty much went across the board. So, and I also can tell you that, like with any other industry, we did have clients that did have some outbreaks, and again, we need to make sure that the protocols there's a situation in which our employees are feeling comfortable and safe when they come into their workplace. But if they are working from home, which many are, and many still are, we're going to need to have controls in place from laptops. One of the first bullet points I had pertaining to last March is, were you guys ready? We had several that were ready, and we had several that were not. And the latter category tended to be more of our smaller clients that dealt less with available laptops and more with traditional desktop computers, which obviously required a lot more work if there was going to be working from home. And then there's a matter of the VPN. Is the VPN strong, and is it available to handle the likely increased bandwidth that was needed and is still needed as a result of people working remotely? And as that changes, continues to change, and there may be more folks working remotely, that increased bandwidth will need to be in place, and also the need for perhaps purchase laptops, an expense that was probably not in the budget for 2020, but going forward, it certainly would need to be there. Video meetings, that is the new norm. I had, prior to last March, I had done one Zoom call my entire life, and like a lot of folks, needed to learn, certainly to have the hardware in place, but also needed to learn how to set them up and also how to conduct them. And they are very different. And that is, again, a situation where there should be some training. There should also be some protocols put into place as to what is accepted behavior for such meetings, whether they are done within our, within the bank or credit union itself with just employees, and certainly those that are with outside folks being in. You want to make sure that there's protocols in place so that there's still proper representation of your financial institution. Then there's the issue of productivity. Those poll numbers that I just read from that newspaper article show that perhaps, not surprisingly, the younger generation has thrived more in this atmosphere of working from home versus those of us that are a little older. Personally, if I'm working from home, I don't have to worry about driving in like I did this morning. I can be more productive. I know the goals and the deadlines that I have to meet, and as a result, working from home doesn't really matter because I know what I have to get done. Not everybody is able to do that. There are some that, although I've worked, for decades in an office environment, many who are in that situation, in that office environment, have found that it is more difficult for them to work without other folks around. And is there a loss of productivity? And that is something that you folks out there should be monitoring, just, because obviously there's going to be a change in productivity. Any losses in that are hopefully not material. And with that home situation, there's distractions. I've had my cat jump up a couple of times in situations, but there's more than likely a lot of you may have some young kids that are home because school is they're not able to attend their schools. Barking dogs is another new norm. So as much as possible, although some of that is more accepted than it had been, you don't want a dog barking during your whole presentation. And you also want to have employees limit the distractions that are in place to make sure that productivity hasn't suffered. From a standpoint of the work that we do within Bonadio, working remotely, working in hotel rooms, we're used to that, and we also had home offices set up for the most part, and we were told to have a home office set up as much as possible that is free of distractions, and that is easier said than done, depending on the situations that you have in your house. But if have that discussion, have that within the guidelines of home offices, especially if it is going to continue on for the foreseeable future. To that end, with changes that have been made, especially for those of you that did not have employees working remotely go through and make sure that employee handbook and corresponding job descriptions are now in agreement with what's going on. The second bullet point, I can't stress this one enough if you haven't, have guidelines in place for working remotely if you have not already done so. Make them very clear, as again, we had talked a moment ago about what's expected versus not expected, and ditto for accepted work from home practices. Wardrobe. I can tell you that as time has gone on, last April, the first couple of times I had calls within audit and supervisory committee meetings, there were shirts and ties and blazers and all of that. And as time has gone on, those wardrobe formalities have largely loosened, and make sure that anybody representing your financial institution to the outside world, that they're aware of what guidelines aren't in place. I've seen some amazingly casual attire, to put it mildly. And then also from a standpoint, even with a background, if there is anything perhaps that would be considered distracting or even inappropriate in the background of your home office, there are ways, one of which is to have false backgrounds put up as well. I'm not a huge fan of those. They tend to cut off your ears and stuff such as that. But make sure that all of those, if you have it, that there are very specific guidelines so that your personnel know what the expectation is. Because although they're working from home, they are still representing your institution. So again, having those put right within job descriptions, and perhaps more importantly within the employee handbook, I think is pretty important. And most of you have those employee handbooks redistributed on an annual basis with signatures of the employees, so they're aware of what needs to be done as well. More frequent internal emails within with our employees. We're not able to walk around the office, see who's doing what, so we want to make sure that everything's still in check and that we've got frequent communication going with those that we're working with. And maybe this is something that we've done at Bonadio, and it's worked pretty well, to implement a process of having virtual check-ins. And it could be something just Friday morning coffee. Many of you perhaps had in the past Friday was coffee and bagels day, and now that isn't being done because folks are working remotely. Just maybe perhaps set something up, and any topic is whether it's work related or not, or and that could be departmental, or you can also have one-on-ones just to make sure that your direct reports are still doing well. We had mentioned that morale can be one of the issues that can take a beating as a result of working from home. Had mentioned a moment ago to revise internal control monitoring. If we're not able to walk around in the office, how are we making sure that our folks are on task to do what we need? Again, it could be with more frequent emails. A couple of those slides back I mentioned with perhaps virtual check-ins, but maybe implementation of a status report on an ongoing basis, since we're not able to see the folks, just to see, hey, these are the items that are that the expectation with whatever project they may be working on, and having those done in writing just so that the employee can take a look at those, and it's a good way for the employee to stay on task, and certainly for those in management to make sure that the employees are doing that as well. I'm internal audit is what I've done, so want to make sure that risk management and internal audit are informed as to what's going on as well. We perform that role for many of you, but for those of you that have your own team in place as well, is there anything that needs to be bumped up to our friends within risk management and internal audit, staying out ahead of the game so that when the time comes for an audit, everybody is aware of what's going on. I mean, we all know that there's going to be changes. What should not be in place is any surprises, and communication should be ongoing in that regard. From an information security standpoint, I'd mentioned this a while ago, that it's always critical. Nobody wants to be in the newspaper saying that there was a security breach within our customer and member information. So re-emphasizing those expectations working in a remote world should be ongoing, and if it's a matter of also going through and changing up based on what's needed to work remotely, multi-factor authentication being one of those, that the expectations are ongoing with the employees, and also if need to go through and change our information security policies and procedures to specify what's done remotely, especially if folks did not have remote employees prior to that. It also means protecting your laptop. Fortunately for me, I started all of this when I'm in a situation where my kids are in college and they haven't been around. Many of you have young kids around. Many of you have situations where your laptop might be laying around, and that needs to be protected, as well as, as much as if you were working in the lobby of a branch within eyesight or within perhaps arm reach of the customers or members that you have within the lobbies. Whereas the reasons could be understood if something happens to that laptop, whether it's damaged or whether it's taken, or whether someone, a youngin at home, it gets on and starts using it. It is not something, again, that is obviously from an information security standpoint acceptable shouldn't be acceptable to any of you on this call, and certainly not to the members and customers that you have. Are there any changes within the limitations of what can be accessed with those working remotely versus when that employee was working from an office? And that's something that, if there's been changes in that, again, it would need to be updated in policies and procedures. Talked a moment ago about hardware protection with the laptops. Document destruction controls. We have seen situations where folks are occasionally going to the office and still coming home. And if you're coming home with hard copy of documents, have there been requirements set up to have on how to properly destroy these documents? They obviously should not just get thrown into the normal trash. Is there a little, you can go to Staples and get personal shredders, and those controls should be set in place and make sure that, again, abundantly clear the expectation that any type of NPPI that would be brought home needs to be destroyed just as much as the shred bin that we're all used to having in our office. All right, with that, we're going to try another poll question. Danielle, hopefully I can do a little better this time. And Danielle, it doesn't appear that I can't see the third poll. Wait a minute. There we go. The biggest impact the pandemic had on us was in lending, B, the branches, C, employees working remotely, or D, all of the above. We'll give that a few minutes, or about a minute. Give it a few more seconds. There's about 8 of you that have not yet answered. Okay, it looks like everyone that's answered is going to answer. I'm going to 5 more seconds. Okay, we'll close this one out. All right, all of the above was the winner in this one. Followed very closely behind by just one vote with employees working remotely, and then 4 answers each to the lending and the branches were the biggest impact. So, speaking of lending, let's talk a little bit about lending. I've mentioned policies and procedures. Outside of perhaps the Bank Secrecy Act policy, there is no policy within financial institutions that gets more scrutiny than the lending policy. And as a result of the last year, many things have changed within lending, from volume, types of loans, and the like. If you haven't already, go through and review that lending policy to make sure that it is representative of what's currently in place at your financial institution. That is one of the first documents that a regulator will look at, and one of the first items that they may put in a regulatory examination comment if the lending policy is not being followed. A word on examiners. When everything last March and April started to shut down, for the most part, we saw our examiner friends take a back seat for a while. And I know that we had several clients where the examiners were on site, packed up, and like the rest of us, worked from home waiting to see what was going to change. I am here to tell you that when they started going back in late last summer, in the fall, they did so with a vengeance. And although they are still largely working remotely, I can tell you that, at least from what we have seen from both a federal standpoint and even with some state examiners, that the leeway that they're giving for issues that may pop up as a result of the pandemic is not much. So suffice it to say that whereas many things may have changed with how you guys are all doing business, but they're coming through and looking at it, making sure, these are the regs and these are what needs to be done. So making sure that your policies, especially your lending policy, is representative of the way you're doing business is important. And also within that lending policy, the loan exception policy that is in place. We've certainly seen that loan policy exceptions have increased as a result of everything that's gone on the last year, and that there's, in those situations, is your loan exception policy specific enough, or is there one, and is it being followed in those situations that the policy has been you have had a lending policy exception. Staffing. Most of you have had increased loan volume over the last year. I know that because every time we call, we'd say, "Oh, we can't get audited right now because the loan volume is so crazy," and that seemed to be across the board. Is there adequate staff for that, and has that staffing been? Is it being looked at on a continuous basis to make sure that you have what you need in place? And also from a standpoint of doing it, the lending remotely, again, has that infrastructure been in place to keep up with that demand so that loans can be processed in the world that we're now living in? And that includes online applications. There may have been some of you that did not take online apps prior, that perhaps you're doing so now. And those remote applications, from a standpoint of getting the proper signage, if e-signatures have been the way to go, make sure that there's proper consent in there to do so. Might not be a bad time to brush up on your knowledge of the e-Sign Act or the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act. Within the loan documentation, the promissory notes, is a wet signature required, meaning a real signature. And if it had been a requirement before but is not now, have your policies changed on that? For those of you that are selling loans on the secondary market, if you haven't, make sure that you know the type of documentation that is still needed from your investors. Nobody wants to have a loan sent back, and it's again, if you have not done so, make sure that you're again keeping up to speed within those great booklets of the requirements that those investors have in place. Branching. We had mentioned this before. I have not stepped foot in a branch since March. I've been using the ITM, and it's great. And I'm not alone. Prior to this happening, I never had to wait for one. Now, seemingly every time I go there, there is a line of cars, as opposed to even when there's a lobby open. Are we ready for that? Security is critical at branches, and as time has gone on, years ago when we did branch audits, we count cash. That's what we did: count cash. Security is more important than that now. The overall controls in place for that cash, the overall security standards that are in the branch offices, dual control, segregation of duties. Any of you that have been through a branch audit, know that those are questions that we're always asking. Has any of that lapsed due to having remote staff? One of the ways that we've seen staffing through this pandemic era is, 1 week some staff comes in, 1 week the other staff comes in. Well, from a standpoint of the branch, what does that do to dual control? Are you putting yourself in a situation where the two employees that need to be in place on that column A, perhaps for the vault in column B as a second, are you making sure that those folks, you've got one person so that you can open the vault if indeed your branches are open to the public? And again, does your branch security manual need to be revised as a result? I had mentioned before that the bank secrecy, BSA and AML, is one of the areas that could be affected by all of this. One of which is if your BSA officer is working remotely, do they have proper access to your BSA model? If you're out there using Patriot Officer, Verifin, BAM, or whatever you have as your model, is that access proper? And it also goes without saying, are there proper information security controls in place for all of that? From a standpoint of review and sign-off, we have seen a few situations out there, especially when it comes to on the CTRs and the SARs, where as a result of working remotely, signatures haven't always been in place. And that was a pretty easy fix. It would be just a standpoint of even an email saying that employee A has reviewed this and employee B has approved it, having that within an email or whatever would need to have in place, and to keep that documentation. Because trust me when I tell you, the examiner, we're looking for this certainly when we do our internal audits, but the examiners are looking for this as well. And that is not going to go away from a standpoint of what needs to be done within those, these two critical documents, again, the CTRs and the SARs pertaining to BSA AML. Make sure that those controls continue to be in place, and if someone is asking for how these were reviewed, signed off, it's readily available. The third bullet on here is something that I think we can all take and make sure that we're aware of. The world has changed. And so from a standpoint of what used to be suspicious behavior or perhaps non-suspicious behavior could very well have changed. One of which is there's a lot less cash out there right now. So are there cash transactions that perhaps a year ago would not have been considered suspicious that now might be? If businesses, we're hearing all about businesses, we're able to survive at about 35% of our previous, income that we used to have come in with the receipts. If those receipts increase in a business that darn well, maybe a restaurant down the street that has limited 15% capacity, if they're bringing in the same amount of cash that they were before, is that something that should raise a red flag from suspicious behavior? And those perhaps standards should be we should all take a step back, and maybe there might be a SAR required or appropriate where it might not have been before. We've talked about segregation of duties overall. Those are critical controls in place. As internal auditors, we hammer that point home. We look for segregation of duties, but are they still in place remotely? And if there's changes as a result of this, again, are those documented overall so that when they're reviewed by auditors or regulators, it is accurate? But more importantly, are the controls in place? There can be perhaps some weakening of controls because some of it is we're not going to be able to change, but where segregation of duties have been in place, maybe we have to think outside the box and creative how we can still have that in place with folks working from home. I think we've hammered this point home. Again, policies and procedures, make sure that they're revised as need be. And similarly, as we talked about within the loan section, other policies the policy exception sections of those policies should be taken a look at, made sure it's clear what is now acceptable policy exceptions in this world, and also what needs to be followed in those situations and documented. I put this slide in here. We've talked a little bit about signatures a moment ago with BSA and AML, but we've also seen some situations where general ledger reconciliations, among other things, the sign-offs were not in place as they were before. And again, the reasoning was from working remotely, but just because those are critical documents, and those GL recons are often a strong control because they're being done by personnel who don't have access to the day-to-day transactions on the system. Seeing those reviewed and signed off, again, if it has to be an email system or an e-signature, whatever needs to be done, make sure that the where signatures needed to be before, they're still in place. Won't spend too much time on DRP, on business continuity. We used to all look perhaps at the pandemic section of these and kind of just go, we were more concerned with perhaps fires or buildings struck by lightning, power shutdowns. Pandemics were not really thought of too much in the forefront. I actually had one client that was literally working on getting their pandemic process up in place January of last year. So they kind of were laughing about it afterwards, saying, the timing was perfect. But certainly if your pandemic section of your DRP is not up to date, it's obviously time to do so now, because you better believe it's going to be reviewed by examiners. So from an office space standpoint, some of the employees that are now working remotely may not ever come back full time, working in an office, and we've certainly seen that within our clients. And we've also seen that article I was just looking at, or I'd mentioned earlier from the Sunday newspaper, had talked about some businesses are taking a look at the impact of this, and also perhaps setting up permanent workstations called hoteling, meaning that if there were before 50 employees that were coming in every day, and it'll probably be more so maybe 50 or so down the road. Do you have hoteling, perhaps having folks sharing a desk or a workspace, and also taking a look at leases as well. If there are any leases that you're part of that can be perhaps renegotiated, you don't need as much space as you had before. Now might be the time to take a look at that. We're looking to see from an overall standpoint, the effect of vaccines and all of that. And the president is saying now maybe by the end of the year, Fauci's been saying it as well, we'll have some sense of normalcy. If that normalcy means that there are going to be personnel that are going to work from home, at least on a part-time basis, ongoing, do you need as much office space? And it's something certainly that you want to take a look at. So other issues to talk about that don't necessarily deal with working remotely, but we've certainly seen out there as the pandemic has been part of our lives, one of which is the allowance for loan and lease losses, the ALLL. Within those reviews, and we've seen now probably 3 or 4 of them, if for those of you who are doing quarterly, and most of you do these on a quarterly basis, how are you taking into consideration everything that's popped up as a result of the pandemic? One of the most direct ones that we have seen is within the qualitative factors that most of you, and if you're not, you should be using, are those qualitative factors taking into consideration the changes that have been in place. We've seen this done a couple of different ways, one of which is the qualitative categories that were in place prior to the pandemic, those that are applicable, the economy, changes in procedures and the like, each of them are having maybe bump up a few basis points as a result of the pandemic, and as long as we're in this current period. What others have done is that they've created a new qualitative factor itself specifically to the pandemic, and the reasoning there is that the other qualitative categories can be kept as is, and we don't want to make any changes going forward, and then we'll take into consideration with this now separate category within the allowance calculation dealing with the pandemic, and then appropriately adding any where things are based currently. And so within the allowance, now is definitely not the time to just carry forward that date from quarter to quarter. Examiners are always looking to see those qualitative factors as detailed as possible, and certainly if there's no changes in those based, and if you've gone through some major changes and based on the poll questions you certainly have, want to make sure that that's up to speed as well. With asset liability management and liquidity, obviously, when I take a look at your liquidity needs, how has that changed as a result of perhaps increased loan volume? Are your borrowing lines still well and good? One of the areas that we always look for when we do an asset liability management audit is to see, even in situations where perhaps one of your borrowing capacities you don't use regularly, at least test it once a year to make sure that it is in place. And if you do get, if we continue to have increased loan volume, will you be able to tap into that so you can keep up with your loan volume? Website, I had mentioned a few minutes ago. You want to make sure the website is up to date with where you stand, if branches are being opened, closed, permanently, temporarily. Make sure that information is current and somebody is taking a look at that on an ongoing basis. And also, if you've changed things with, I'd mentioned that a few slides back on the lending side, if there are more now for your own institution, perhaps online applications that the website can handle it. Adherence to regs, I had mentioned that a few minutes ago. Examiners are not budging when it comes to adhering to regs, so neither should you. So the future is now. We'll get to one last poll question. We'll open it up. As of today, our operations have largely returned to normal, somewhat. Or see, give you a few seconds on that. While you folks are answering that, one of the most interesting topics I saw in this newspaper article from Sunday, a poll found that 29% of working professionals surveyed said they would quit if they could not have the option to continue to work remotely. So that is something to perhaps keep in mind, even if you folks will all be available to be operating as normal before. Maybe your employees have quite liked being able to work from home, so it is something to consider. I'm going to give you 5 more seconds. Looks like I've got about 8 people left to finish this. Okay, we'll close this out. And the majority have somewhat returned to normal, which probably should not surprise any of us. So returning to normal, what is normal going to be in 2021 and beyond? That remains to be seen. From a standpoint of the effect of the vaccines, will it give our customers and members more comfort to come back into the office? Will you all have more folks, everything back to normal, full staffing in both your lobbies and your back office? that is entirely probable. And I think if any of us have learned over the last year trying to predict what's going to happen with all of this, is certainly perhaps educated guess at best. What changes and what doesn't. Maybe what doesn't is what I just read. If there's if employees are feeling strongly about working from home maybe a couple of days a week going forward, even once it's safe for them to return back to the workplace, and that's something that you folks will need to take a look at and again determine as to how that will be rolled out to your staff, and also how it will affect your business going forward. And with that, there's only a couple of minutes left for questions. One of the questions that we've seen, and I'll get out in front of this, and as this has all happened, is again, folks are asking us, do your other clients have people working from home? And obviously the answer has been yes on that. And, as I had mentioned before, some were able to handle this a little better than others. And, maybe it is just this whole pandemic has fast forwarded everything to a standpoint of where we need to, what is going to be the new norm. So looking to see if there's any other questions that have come in. I am not seeing any. We're right at 11:58. If there are any questions that you folks want to handle online, my information is on the last slide, both from a standpoint of phone and email. I thank you all for your attendance on this. Hopefully we're able to get to provide some controls that you guys will all be able to use, and as you go forward, and everybody stay healthy and stay safe. And I thank you for your participation.